Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Kevin Swain. I'm the student president of the Buckley program here at Yale. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to say a quick word about the program. The Buckley program is the only club at Yale dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity here on campus. We accomplish this goal in a number of ways, including lectures, seminars, an annual conference, disinvitation dinner, and through firing line debates. We hope you'll visit our website to learn more, if you'd like to, at buckleyprogram.com. Thanks for being here. Also, I'd like to say a quick word. We just want to thank all of our supporters who make our events possible, and especially for Tom Hood, Yale class of 1969, for generously supporting this series. Okay, now to our guest. Yuval Levin is the founding editor of National Affairs and director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff under President George W. Bush, and was the executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics. He's the author of several books on political theory and public policy, most recently, The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. Dr. Levin's current scholarship focuses on the ongoing decay of American institutions, and in early 2020, he'll publish his next book, titled A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Yuval Levin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the welcome and the introduction, and it's always great to be at Yale, and to be here for the Buckley program is especially fun. I love the way that you introduce yourselves as being about intellectual diversity, which is both true and a wonderful way to think about what a program like this is about on a campus like this. It makes me think a little bit of the Labor Day parade in the town of Kensington, Maryland, where I live, that we just went to a week ago, where the parade consists of a kind of barrage of basically activist groups on the left, one after another, carrying all kinds of signs, and then there's a little car with a Republican Party flag and a sign, and it says, "Dare to be different." And that is the motto of the Republican Party in my county, apparently. It's quite a world we live in. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you, and especially for the peculiar kind of opportunity that I've been offered here this semester, where the Buckley program has asked me to come 3 times to campus to give 3 related lectures and 3 related seminars. And that gives you a kind of chance to try to lay out an extended argument over a period of time. Each of the parts of it can stand on their own, but it also adds up to a longer thought about the state of American society. And so I thought that I would use the opportunity offered by the Buckley program to do that, to talk with you about a rather peculiar subject, a way of getting at some of the problems we have in American society at this point that that doesn't take on the most familiar political terms, but that tries to think a little bit about what's upstream of our politics and what drives our political debates, our political dysfunction, our cultural battles. And so to think a little bit from the surface of our politics down, and then try to see what we learn and how we might apply it. I do begin, and especially in this first talk, with the simple fact, I think, that Americans are at this point living through a kind of social crisis. This is, in its own way, a straightforward fact. It's easy to see. And yet a part of this crisis, one of its symptoms, is that we can't really quite seem to get a handle on exactly what it is that's wrong, and on whether the frustration and the foreboding and despair that so often define the national mood at this point are themselves the problem or are marks of a deeper dysfunction. That mood itself is pretty hard to miss, and it certainly seems like more than just a mood. In our public life, it presents itself in bitter divisions, intractable frustrations, in a kind of explosion of populist anger that crosses many demographic and partisan categories, and that often seems to paralyze our system of government, even as it energizes our politics. That anger was decisive in the last presidential election. It looks likely to transform our political priorities and expectations for a long time to come. In the culture, too, a certain kind of frustration or hostility often seems to predominate, and this seems to be a time of breakdown or of confrontation. It's like we don't quite know how to deal with each other. Our ability to just carry on honest conversations has been degraded by some kind of loss of trust or common ground, people often behave as though we can't quite even hold a set of facts or premises in common. On a lot of college campuses, resentment and aggrievement seems sometimes to boil just under the surface, and some basic norms of open inquiry and mutual respect are under threat as a result of that. And in a lot of our institutions, various kinds of identity politics of both the left and the right undermine the foundations of unity. Social media have come to feel increasingly antisocial, feeding this confrontation or aggravation. But it's actually worse than that, because the problem is not just about how we talk to each other or how we address our differences or take up public problems. The crisis is evident not just in our political and cultural interactions, but in the personal lives of countless Americans for whom hopelessness or alienation can descend into outright despair as a practical matter. In a lot of communities in our country, an epidemic of opioid abuse has laid bare an underlying scourge of isolation and desperation and misery. More than 40,000 Americans died from overdoses of opioids in 2018. Many more live every day under the burden of addiction to these drugs. And opioids are used to dull pain, not to sharpen experience. They're sought as an escape from suffering. And when you step back and listen, an awful lot of what is distinct about this moment in America seems like a response to a certain kind of suffering, a response to being left behind or disrespected, to being robbed of place or dignity or hope. But why? None of us wants to look at suffering, at breakdown or frustration like this and say that we don't really understand its sources. But what if we don't? The fact is that the usual markers of failure or trouble don't quite help us to understand this particular situation. We often talk as though we can readily see why our social fabric is frayed in the ways I've just suggested, but it actually isn't all that obvious. Traditional economic concerns, which are a first resort for a lot of social analysts, really don't cut it very well as explanations. We certainly experienced a very severe recession in 2007 and 2008, and the economy has been relatively sluggish for most of this century. But that recession did end a decade ago, and we've actually been living through one of the longest economic expansions of the modern era. Unemployment now is very low, even in those regions where our social crisis seems to be centered. The labor participation rate, that is a kind of measure of people's desire to work, is not as low now as it was a few years ago, and it suggests at least some improvement when it comes to people's sense of connection to American economic life. Inflation is also low, and so are interest rates and loan default rates and most of the other traditional kinds of economic warning signs. It's not that slow growth has not been a problem, it's just that it's nowhere near enough to explain the kind of crisis that we seem to be living through. Other familiar measures of well-being, both absolute and relative, don't offer obvious explanations either. Crime is down, and we're safer than ever in America. Some demographic groups have certainly seen their health decline some in this century, although in general Americans are healthier. And even those declines don't come close to explaining the sources of people's anxiety. And in some ways, they actually seem to be symptoms as much as causes of a crisis of isolation and despair. In fact, some observers have actually argued that the frustration and anxiety that seem to overwhelm us now are rooted in essentially imaginary grievances, so that they are themselves the problem. Harvard's Steven Pinker takes these complaints to be basically just irritable gestures of self-indulgent ingratitude. In a new book, he reviews mountains of data on wealth and health and safety and choice and concludes that populist complaints on all sides of our politics are just detached from reality and that they're dangerous too. He says, quote, "Indiscriminate pessimism can lead to fatalism, to wondering why we should throw time and money at a hopeless cause, and it can lead to radicalism, to calls to smash the machine and drain the swamp or empower a charismatic tyrant," end quote. But surely it's at least a little bit silly to suggest that public frustration is just a kind of self-delusion, especially frustration that runs this deep and that's revealed itself in such a broad range of symptoms. Pinker's happy data are not wrong, and neither are the encouraging economic indicators. But if these don't explain the reigning sentiments of our time, we should ask ourselves what these kinds of indicators might ignore and what signs we might be missing. In considering that sort of question, we should remember a crucial diagnostic principle, that we have to be careful not to overvalue excess and undervalue absence. When a patient presents at a doctor's office complaining of fatigue, for example, the doctor doesn't just prescribe more sleep, though maybe that's part of the treatment. The doctor also considers whether the patient might be lacking in iron, say. That kind of deficiency is not at all obvious directly from the symptom, but it can become apparent through a broader knowledge of the human organism. We can say something similar here. The massive social crisis that we confront, whether it's evident as populism or polarization or resentment or mistrust or a soul-crushing despair, certainly does require some direct responses. To treat it seriously, we have to listen to what it leaves people asking for, and we should try to help them to get it. Our populist politics should not be ignored, for instance, and it's right that it should reorder the nation's priorities some. But this explosion of frustration and resentment might also suggest that our society is in need of something that it lacks but isn't asking for. And that's a challenge in a democracy. It's a challenge that requires us to consider what we know about the complex social organism that is a free society, and not just what we hear each other saying in frustration. So how do you study an absence like that? We would have to study its shape, its structure, its consequences, its gravitational pull, and ask ourselves some questions. What does the missing thing look like? What is the nature of the deficiency that we feel? What would it mean to take on the shape of this kind of gap and so to fill it? These sorts of questions start to gesture toward a different kind of diagnosis. The absence that we feel looks like isolation and mistrust and alienation, and so it looks like a shortage of belonging and confidence and legitimacy. If that's the case, then it shouldn't surprise us that our traditional indicators of wealth and health and personal freedom aren't raising alarms. These familiar indicators, important as they are largely material and individual. They assess our well-being on our own. But none of us can actually experience well-being on his own. It's in the joints of society, at the junctures of individuals and the interstices of life that the trouble really shows itself. One way to put that point is that many of our struggles seem rooted in relational problems. Loneliness and isolation, mistrust and suspicion, alienation or polarization, these are characteristic maladies of our time, and they're failures of sociality, so they can fall into a kind of blind spot for our individualist culture. Some observers of our time certainly do see this, at least some forms of it. New York Times columnist David Brooks, for instance, has argued that contemporary college students are living through what he calls a crisis of connectedness that keeps them from finding their places and roles in the larger society. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, has suggested that our challenges are, quote, related to a lack of community and connection to something greater than ourselves. Fine, that certainly starts to get at something more like what we find expressed in the complaints that are flooding our culture, but it's certainly only a beginning. This crisis of connectedness has itself been described in a variety of ways. A number of analysts across the political spectrum have argued that it must be ultimately philosophical or metaphysical, that contemporary liberalism is so committed to the ideal of individual liberation that it lacks the framework, the conceptual framework, to articulate ideals of solidarity, even just of community. We depend on these kinds of deeper social foundations, and yet we lack the tools to maintain or rebuild them when they break down. Other people, mostly on the right, have suggested that the core of the crisis is a collapse of family and religion, and that without these preconditions for flourishing, we end up uprooted or adrift. That would suggest that our social crisis is a breakdown of tradition and of moral order. And others, especially on the left, have argued that although simple economic measures of well-being can't quite show us what's wrong, the trouble is still fundamentally material, that contemporary capitalism elevates the interests of the wealthiest above the rest, and so creates levels of inequality that make it impossible for people to feel and function like equal parts of a larger whole, or to believe in the legitimacy of our political and economic order. We're left thinking that success is not related to legitimate forms of merit, and so that our society exists to benefit other people, not ourselves, which drives a wave of alienation. These kinds of diagnoses are certainly closer to the mark, and I think they're also closer to each other than they sometimes seem to be. They treat the human person as embedded in a larger whole, whether that's a metaphysical or a moral or a social or economic whole, and they grasp that what's wrong now has to do with the way in which we live out that embeddedness. But although all of these various approaches to problems of connectedness are helpful, they share in common an idea of connectedness that still seems lacking as a way of diagnosing our contemporary challenges. All of them essentially envision a kind of formless connectedness, whether it's a way of being linked in principle or of interacting one by one. They imagine American society as a vast open space that's filled with people, and they call for ways of helping these people link hands and be closer together and share some common experiences or ideals. That's the reigning, if often implicit, metaphor of American social life. And so we talk about breaking down walls or building bridges or casting some unifying vision to strengthen our society. We hope sometimes that maybe social media could bind people together this way if it's done right, or that the ideals of our politics would give us the conceptual framework for unity, or that our moral or religious traditions would reinvigorate the springs of solidarity, or that by narrowing the differences between rich and poor we could make our society more unified. There's a lot of appeal to this idea and to all of the different forms of the case for solidarity that's made by a variety of social critics across our society. But something crucial is still lacking in this vision of connectedness. There's a missing step, I think, between joining together and recovering belonging and trust and legitimacy. Formless connectivity isn't going to get us there. What we're missing, although we too rarely put it this way, is not just connectedness, but some kind of structure of social life, a way to give shape and purpose and concrete meaning and identity to the things that we do together. If American life is a big open space, it's not a space filled with individuals. It's a space filled with these structures of social life. It's a space filled with institutions. And if what we're too often failing to find in our common life is belonging and legitimacy and trust, then more than a failure of connection, we confront a failure of institutions. Institutions do a lot more than connect us, and understanding our social crisis in terms of what they are and what they do could help us to see that crisis in a new light and to grasp more about it. The idea that institutions should be central to how we study core social phenomena like these is actually not a controversial notion in the social sciences, at least not anymore. The last several decades have seen the emergence of a so-called new institutionalism in a number of fields, especially in sociology and in economics and in political science. That new institutionalism has flowered in ways that have made it not a return to an older era of institutionalist social science, but a real advance over it. That prior era ended in the middle decades of the 20th century, when scholars with different kinds of critiques of a fundamentally institution-minded social science broke from that mainstream and eventually broke it altogether. Behavioralists and rational choice theorists, various kinds of postmodernists, offered alternatives for understanding the sources and motives of political and social and economic action. But the social sciences couldn't remain divorced from the study of institutions for very long, and when those fields returned to institutions, they did so armed with some important insights from the work of these various kinds of dissidents and critics. The new institutionalism of this century has therefore been more sophisticated about motives, more alert to incentives and biases, more skeptical of formal restraints on power, and more sensitive to the significance of history and context in common action. In sociology and in economics and political science and other fields, this has yielded a lot of insights that could serve us well in this discussion, but it's not a way of thinking that has generally guided the broader public understanding of our contemporary social crisis, which is a crisis with political and social and economic dimensions, and yet generally has not been interpreted as fundamentally about institutions in this sense. I want to interpret it that way with you over the course of this discussion and of these lectures, and to see what the lens of institutions might reveal that's otherwise been hidden. I can put this another way. When we think about the challenges that our society faces, we tend to think about the array of forces that are pressing in on it: globalization or automation or polarization or populism, radical individualism or ethnic nationalism. But what stands out about our time is not the strength of the pressures that are acting on our society. Within living memory, our societies had to confront internal and external pressures and challenges that have objectively been much greater than these. Look in on the America of the early 1970s, for example, and you'll find a society that seems to have much bigger problems than we do, in all sorts of ways. That's what leaves some of the people who are trying to diagnose our society now so confused. What does stand out about our time, though, is not the strength of these pressures, but the weakness of our institutions. From the family on up through the national government, with lots in between, which leaves us less able to handle the pressure and to hold us together. And it leaves us with something more like formless connectedness, a social life that's lacking in structural supports, which can work fine for people with lots of social capital to spend, but doesn't work nearly as well for those who need to build their stock of it. This term social capital, which I'm going to come back to a few times, is a metaphor, of course. It describes the resources at our disposal to enable effective cooperation, the skills and habits, the networks and arrangements, the grooves and channels that make it possible for our society to hold together and for its members to benefit from it. It's a cold kind of metaphor. It reeks of economics, but its coldness is actually its power, I think. It's a way for people who aren't very comfortable with the warm vocabulary of religion and of civic life to nonetheless describe how human communities hold together. And so I'll use it for their benefit because it does convey a set of insights that shouldn't just belong to one faction in our culture. And it might allow us to talk together about some difficult realities that Americans are having trouble describing to each other. In a sense, a depletion of social capital and a failure to replenish it is one way to describe the challenges that are facing a lot of Americans now. And as we'll see, it results directly from the wilting of our institutions. Now, if that's right, if what's distinct about our social crisis is the weakness of our institutions, then the challenge we face is a kind of challenge of institutional revival. And yet our politics and culture are horrifically ill-suited now to institutional revival, combining as they do a populism that says that all our institutions are rigged against the public with an identity politics that rejects institutional commitments, with a celebrity culture that chafes against any kind of structure and constraint. And whatever you think of him, we have a president now who embodies all three of these powerful trends in his person, like a kind of microcosm of our culture. That means that the revival we want will require a real change of attitude and a transformation of our diagnosis of contemporary problems, let alone of the solutions that we might try. It requires us to put some key questions about institutions front and center, which does not come naturally. So how might we start to do that? If we're going to understand the contemporary crisis in terms of institutions, we obviously first need some definition of the term to work with. And that's actually not nearly as simple as it seems. One of the consequences of the new institutionalism in the social sciences is an increasing divergence of definitions within and between fields of study. Some observers define institutions above all as collections of rules or norms, or even habits. Others incline to a more functional definition that sees institutions as means of integrating people toward the performance of some key social goals. Some people see institutions as channels for power, ways of applying authority. These differences in part represent the points of view of different academic disciplines or of schools within disciplines, but they also get at the immense variety of roles that institutions play in any society. A concept so basic is inherently going to be hard to define. But I want to suggest to you a particular definition anyway, both because my own background is in political science and because our purpose here is to understand our social crisis in particular in terms of institutions. I incline toward a definition that is broad but particular. By institutions, I mean the durable forms of our common life. They are the forms and structures of what we do together. Some institutions are organizations. They have something like corporate form, a university like this, or a hospital, a school, a legislature, a military, a company, a civic association. These are all institutions, and they're technically or legally formalized. Some institutions are durable forms of a different sort. They might be shaped by laws or norms or rules, but without a corporate structure. The family is an institution. In fact, it's the first and foremost institution of every society. We can speak of the institution of marriage or of a particular tradition or a profession as an institution, of the rule of law itself as an institution. That they're durable is essential to their being institutions. An institution keeps its shape over time, and so it shapes the realm of life in which it operates. When it changes, it usually does so by incremental evolution of its shape and structure, not by sharp transformation, so that its form over time exhibits a certain continuity that's important to how it functions. But most important, I describe each of these as a form of association for a reason. What's distinct about an institution is that it is a form, in the deepest sense. A form is a structure, a shape, a contour. But as Aristotle tells us, the form of a thing is at once distinguishable and inseparable from its materials or its substance. It's the shape of the whole, the organization that speaks of its purpose and its logic and its function and its meaning. The forms of the world around us impress themselves on our perception and on our imagination. They shape our understanding of the boundaries of our experience. They give us an idea of what it means to form, to transform, to reform, to deform, to conform. This is how our institutions shape our social existence and our associational lives. But form is important here also because institutions, by their nature, are formative. They structure our interactions, and as a result, they structure us. They form our habits and our expectations, and ultimately they form our character. By giving shape to our experience of life in society, institutions give shape to our place in the world. They're the means by which we're socialized, and so they're essential intermediaries between our inner lives and our social lives. They're how the city and the soul shape each other. This has a lot to do with why a crisis of institutions would present itself maybe most powerfully as a crisis of our inner lives, a crisis of despair and isolation, of loneliness and loss of purpose. A crisis, we might say, of social shapelessness is how we can be at once too confrontational and too lonely, in touch with everyone but untouched by anyone, alienated together. And this also helps us to see why we're so oddly blind to institutions when we think about the social crisis that our society faces now. The notion that we're formed by institutions runs against the grain of how we too often incline to think about the human person, and about freedom, and about justice and choice, and many of the other things we care about. Institutions play a role that we would rather believe is not necessary. They form us by mediating between each of us and all of us. The resistance to this idea is nothing new, especially in America. We have actually always tended to be blind to institutions and to resist them. Our popular culture has its roots in a dissenting Protestantism that sought a direct connection to the divine and rejected as inauthentic or illegitimate most forms of institutional mediation. The desire for immediacy, for authenticity, is one of the most distinctly American facets of our national character. So that even though Americans actually stand out as institution builders in practice, we have a written constitution, for example, that's basically an institutional outline. We have a civil society that is teeming with institutions of all shapes and sizes. Yet our national ethic is in important respects anti-institutional and always has been. We can see this in the ways in which we understand our own history. When progressives tell the American story, for example, they speak in terms of vast social movements, crashing as waves on our shores, notable particularly for their lack of institutional formalities. When conservatives tell the story, we tend to speak in terms of principles more than institutions. And so we find in the American founding a kind of intellectual achievement more than an institutional one. For all that we insist we love the Constitution, we tend to hate the Congress and the presidency and the courts, and those are the Constitution. Today, the right inclines to argue about the role of government fairly abstractly, about its boundaries, more than about how its institutions should operate within those boundaries. And of course, in the age of Trump, the right barely advances even that argument. Conservatives instead approach our institution with extraordinary suspicion and hostility. And the left, at the same time, is drawn to identity politics, which is a politics largely devoid of institutions, often hostile to them. It attributes to people a place based on their biology or ethnicity, and so treats their unformed selves as what there is to know. Looking for ways to make a difference, younger Americans tend, therefore, not to think in terms of channeling their ambitions through the institutions of our society, but rather of going around them and having more direct effect. Because our politics has always rewarded those who can successfully claim the mantle of outsiders, and it certainly does so now, the temptation to approach our institutions oppositionally or to avoid them altogether has always been very strong. So when we look for solutions, we tend to look not to our institutions but to individuals or to movements or to ideals or maverick outsiders. But maybe above all, what we resist is the very idea that we would need to be formed by institutions at all. Our desire for immediacy is rooted in a commitment to the authenticity or wholeness of the individual. The American ideal of freedom, which has often been at the core of our political imagination, is rooted in the premise that the choosing individual is the foundation of our social order. Liberating that person, whether from oppression or necessity or coercion or constraint, has been understood to be the foremost purpose of our politics. Our parties have argued about how to do that, or about what kind of liberation the individual most desires or requires, but they've agreed, at least implicitly, that once properly liberated, that person could be free. There is, of course, a deeper, older idea of freedom that contends that in order to be free, we need more than just to be liberated. We need to be formed for freedom, given the tools of judgment and character and habit to use our freedom responsibly and well. And that kind of formation for freedom is a key part of what our institutions are for, starting with the family and spreading outward to the institutions through which we work and learn, worship and govern, and otherwise organize ourselves. All of those institutions form the people within them. But the idea that this should be required for freedom has never really sat well with us. And so the idea that we need institutions never quite has either. All this helps us to see why we don't naturally turn to institutions when we think about what's gone wrong in American life. But there is one facet of our experience of breakdown lately that we do tend to understand in terms of institutions. And it could help us to grasp even more clearly why the formative character of our institutions has to be front and center. To the extent that institutions do come up in our diagnoses nowadays, it's in terms of a broad and systematic loss of trust in institutions, which we take to be one important symptom of what's ailing our society. And so it's worth thinking about that symptom for a moment, just to take us a little bit deeper into the argument. The broad social crisis that I've been talking about has plainly been accompanied by a broad-based loss of faith in institutions. Measures of that loss are very easy to find, and they paint a grim picture. To take just one store of that data, Gallup has kept track of what it calls Americans' confidence in institutions for decades now, in most cases from 1973 until today. And the trend in those figures is unmistakable. From big business and banks and the professions to the branches of the federal government, the news media, the academy, Gallup has found that confidence in our institutions has been plummeting for decades. In the early 1970s, 80% of Americans said that they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in doctors and hospitals, for example. Last year, that figure was 37%. 40 years ago, 65% of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in organized religion. Last year, 40% said so. 60% expressed confidence in public schools in the 70s. Just a third of Americans did last year. Even in 1975, a year after Richard Nixon's resignation in disgrace, 52% of Americans expressed confidence in the presidency. Last year, 32% had that confidence. Gallup even found that 42% of the public had confidence in Congress in the 1970s. Last year, that figure was 12%. And even that seems high. This kind of pattern holds for just about all of the institutions that Gallup asked about. The military and law enforcement and local government were the only real exceptions, while a few institutions like the courts have fallen less sharply in the public's estimation, but they've still fallen. We'll certainly see what we can learn from those exceptions, but the overall trend is unmistakable. The American public has gone from extraordinary levels of confidence in our major institutions to striking levels of mistrust. But this picture of sharply declining faith or trust in institutions forces us to ask just what we mean by faith or trust in institutions. And that question should send us back to the definition of institutions that I've suggested, and maybe to deepen it a little by thinking about what it is that institutions do in our society. To say that they are the durable forms of our common life is to say also, generally speaking, that each institution works to accomplish some socially important task, say educating the young or making laws or defending the country or producing some service or product, by establishing a structure and a process, a form for combining people's efforts toward accomplishing that task. So in effect, the institution also forms people so as to carry out that task effectively and responsibly and reliably. It fosters an ethic that defines how they go about their common work, and that in turn shapes their behavior and their character in doing so. That ethic often involves a way of achieving the core purpose or goal of the institution, while at the same time guarding against some of the dangers that always follow us into social life, like the dangers of individual selfishness or avarice or ambition or vice. We value the institution because it carries out that task, but also because it forms people to do it appropriately or properly or ethically. And that understanding of the role of institutions helps to clarify what trust in an institution might mean to people. We trust an institution because it seems to have an ethic that makes the people within it more trustworthy. So we trust political institutions because they're shaped to take seriously some kind of obligation to the public interest as they pursue the work of self-government, and they shape the people who populate them to do the same. We trust the military because it values courage and honor and duty in carrying out the defense of the country, and it forms men and women who do that too. We trust a business when it promises quality and integrity in meeting some need that we have and rewards its people when they deliver that. We trust a university because it's shaped and shapes the people within it to be devoted to learning and to truth. We trust a journalistic institution because it has high standards of honesty or accuracy in reporting the news and make the work of its people reliable. And so we lose faith in an institution when we no longer believe that it plays this ethical or formative role. That might happen, for example, when institutions just plainly fail to protect us from avarice or selfishness or vice when they carry out their work, as when a bank might cheat its customers, or when a member of the clergy abuses a child. The gross abuses of power revealed over the past few years by the Me Too movement have shaken our confidence in some important institutions in that kind of way. But another related but I think distinct way in which an institution can lose our trust is when it fails to impose an ethic on the people within it and seems to exist only to serve those individuals' interests. It's not quite corruption, it's a different way of thinking about its own purpose. And such an institution seems not to be worthy of our trust, not because it's failed to earn it exactly, but because it seems not to seek it or to desire it at all. And something like that is what has been happening to a lot of our institutions in recent decades. In fact, I think our very understanding of what institutions are for has changed subtly but fundamentally. As I'll try to show over the next couple of lectures, we have moved, very roughly speaking, from thinking of institutions as molds that shape and form people's character towards seeing them as platforms that allow people to be themselves and to display themselves before a wider world. And that subtle, gradual change in expectations has driven and magnified our loss of trust in institutions. This move from mold to platform is a way of describing what's happened in an awful lot of the institutions of our society in different realms of life. When we don't think of our institutions as formative, but as performative, when the presidency and Congress are just stages for individual performance art, when a university becomes a venue for virtue signaling, when journalism becomes hard to distinguish from activism, when the church becomes a political stage, they become harder to trust. They aren't really asking for our trust, they're just asking for our attention. And in our time, a lot of the most significant social and political and cultural and intellectual institutions seem to be in the process of going through this transformation from mold to platform. The few exceptions, again, most notably the military, the most unabashedly formative of our national institutions, tend to prove the rule because they tend to be the few institutions in which we aren't losing faith. And many of the genuinely novel institutions of the 21st century, especially the virtual institutions of social media, are inherently shaped as platforms, not as molds. They're ways for us to be seen, not ways for us to be transformed by an ethic shared with others. It would be strange to trust a platform, and we generally don't. That change of attitude, that decline in the expectation that our institutions should be formative, is at the heart of our loss of faith in institutions. And it is in turn at the heart of our broader social crisis, because institutions understood as platforms rather than as molds, as stages to perform on rather than as means to form and shape our character, are just less able to offer us objects of loyalty and sources of legitimacy and means of building trust. They become venues for acting alone, not together, and they therefore contribute to the sense of alienation and detachment that pervades our social life, rather than helping us to address or overcome it. This change in expectations and in the character of our institutions hasn't come out of nowhere. It's been driven by the same forces that have underlaid the broader transformation of our society over the past half century and more. As we've come to put less value in unity, not to say conformity, and to put more value in individual self-realization, we've naturally inclined to reject the ideal of the formative institution. We've called upon each American to become more fully himself or herself, and so we've implicitly put aside the notion that our social institutions exist to form us together. And by failing to see the formative purpose of institutions, we undermine that purpose. And so we advance an idea of institutions as not molds but platforms, and contribute to a set of social transformations that, again, in our politics and in education and in the media and in the professions, tend to separate people in the very attempt to unite them, to undermine our aptitude for freedom in the very act of liberating us, to eat away our capacity for patient toleration, our decorum, our forbearance, our restraint, to cause us to mistake expression for reflection, affirmation for respect, reaction for responsibility, and an empty celebrity for an earned reputation. The transformation of our understanding of the role of institutions doesn't simply explain all of this, of course. It's not the cause of our broad social crisis, and it doesn't offer the answer to the challenges that crisis has posed for us, but it's the cause we tend to be most blind to, and so it's worth seeing and articulating. And it also does point toward an answer to one of the deepest quandaries that seems to confront us now. When we look at our challenges, we always notice that addressing them seems like it would require a return or a reversal or a recapturing of something lost. And this leaves us thinking that recovery may be as impossible as unscrambling eggs. It contributes to the despair that now so often prevails in our social commentary and to the blinding nostalgia that afflicts our politics. But the idea that what we require is reversal is itself, I think, in part a function of failing to think institutionally, or of failing to grasp the real structure and character of human society. The fact is that what we need is not reversal, but renewal. And renewal is always a possibility for human societies because our social life is generational. Every end is also always a beginning because the world is always new to the rising generation. The young have the energy that the old might lack. They have the ambition that the old have spent, the hope that the old have either realized or depleted. What they lack is formation, and that is what renewal requires too. Although renewal is always possible, it doesn't happen by itself. It depends on some essential preconditions which can allow us to turn the inheritance that's left to the young from a burden into a resource, and to enable the hope and energy of a rising generation to fuel fulfillment instead of disillusionment. Some of these preconditions are structural, we might say, or supportive. Renewal requires safety and order and law and justice and avenues to dignity and legitimacy and friendship and honor. But some of these preconditions are moral or formative. Renewal requires that the rising generation, like every generation in society, be socialized and moralized and formed to thrive, that we all be made better and more capable of reaching our potential. We often speak as though renewal were a matter of social transformation, and it is in part, but it is at its core a matter of personal transformation. Enduring progress happens soul by soul, but that's precisely why it can really only happen through the institutions of our society, which touch and form each of us. We're always in need of essentially personal formation, which we ironically cannot hope to get on our own. And this points to the great mystery that confronts our society now. How can we help people be better able to benefit from the advantages that our kind of society offers them, and better able to overcome the disadvantages? The answer to that is a matter of personal formation, much more than social reform. Or rather, a matter of understanding social reform is geared to personal formation. And the crucial missing ingredient in that kind of understanding is a particular idea of institutions in society, an understanding of institutions as formative, and so also as links between the personal and the social. Such institutions help provide both the structural and moral preconditions for renewal. They offer us objects for loyalty and parameters for dignity, sources of legitimacy, means of attaining status and respect, and protections from the darker sides of human nature. And so they offer us formation. They can shape us if we let them. Our institutions at every level of our society can offer us all this if we approach them as molds. That is, if we pour ourselves into them and let them shape us and our place in society, rather than approaching them as platforms for us to perform on, as just another stage to be seen saying the right thing or being on the right side. But in our approach to institutions, we've been moving in precisely the opposite direction. Seeing that could help us to better understand our social crisis. But more important than that, and to a greater degree than almost any other facet of that crisis, I think seeing that institutions are crucial to the problem can give us some things to do about our social crisis, some steps that just about any of us can take to make things better in those institutions that are within our reach. And there are some such institutions for each of us, wherever we are, whatever we do. You're surely asking how and why, and that's the great thing about a series of lectures. It lets us sketch out a thought and then fill it in. By this point, if I've done my job, you're surely eager for examples in particular, for a sense of how this works in practice. And that is where we're headed if you're here in a month in the next lecture. We'll think about our social crisis through the lens of several particular institutions to illustrate some of the points that I've sketched out here and go deeper. We'll look at politics, at the professions, at the university, and the church and the family. And then, in the third lecture, we'll try to think about what this approach to institutions could have to offer as a source of solutions, or at least of partial remedies, to the peculiar challenges of this daunting moment in our national life. It's easy to take this kind of approach to our country's challenges as a cause for despair. In a sense, what I'm saying is the problem is everywhere, and it's huge and daunting, and that's true. But we'll find that this very fact is also why some solutions might be within reach, and why there are plenty of causes for hope that ought to keep us from despair. Ending the first of 3 lectures is an easy feat. I can say to you there's more to come, and I'll answer every question you have that way. But I hope that at least I've given you enough of a sense of where this argument is headed, so that in the next few weeks, as you look out over the circus that is now our popular culture and our political culture, you'll begin to see in it a pattern with something to tell us. That you'll notice that in every one of our major institutions, key people who should see themselves as insiders with responsibility instead tend to see themselves as outsiders with a platform. When the president tweets a complaint about the Department of Justice, ask yourself, what does he think his job is in relation to their job? When the member of Congress complains about how Congress is a waste of time and is corrupted, ask yourself, who does she think Congress is composed of? When fellow students demand only to hear arguments that they agree with, ask yourself what they think that education involves. When you find yourself taking to social media to prove that you're on the right side of the latest outrage, ask yourself, what exactly am I planning to do here, and why? Ask yourself questions like that, and next month we'll try to think about what the answers might be. So I'll end there for now.
Hi, I'm Fausto, a junior here at Yale studying EP&E. And I think, at least from my perspective, that a large part of the decline in the trust that we have in institutions can be attributed to a shift in perspective that they are now somehow insidious machines for the preservation of privilege and that they oppress the rest of civilization. They've somehow become a scapegoat for all sorts of injustice in society. And I find that to be true, and people's commentaries about Yale, about business, about economics is somehow malign in its very essence and then not as a tool. Yeah. And so I'd like to understand how that happened and why, because institutions became methods for oppression rather than opportunity. And how can we start to salvage them if we are to interact with them once again?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and it's certainly in part where this is headed. I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I would say one thing to understand about the decline of trust in institutions in American society since the middle of the 20th century is that trust in institutions was amazingly, bizarrely high in the middle of the 20th century. Coming out of the Depression, the Second World War, a period of several decades of enormous mobilization, the American public had very high confidence in large institutions, much higher than would have been the case at the beginning of the 20th century or in the middle of the 19th century. And so in one sense, we've experienced a decline to something more like a normal level that feels to us like a dramatic transformation and a fall. Now, that on the one hand says we might have something to learn from 19th century America, and I think we have a lot to learn now from 19th century America, a country dealing with a lot of transformational changes that are similar to what we're experiencing in some respects. But we're different from them because we went through that period and now are here. And we went through that period particularly in the lifespan of an enormously dominant generation in our society's self-understanding. The people born in the wake of the Second World War, the people we think of as baby boomers, lived their life through this span of, at first, very, very high confidence in institutions, a very cohesive society that was liberalizing in a variety of important ways, good ways generally, now to a society that has just much less confidence in itself and its institutions. And our society's self-understanding of that change cannot be separated from the life experience of the baby boomers, I think, which is to say, we're living in a time when America thinks of itself as a retiree, when our entire society thinks of itself as having aged in a particular way, and our self-understanding is still very dominated by the point of view of the boomers. You can see this in our politics, right? Our president is 74, the Speaker of the House is 77, the Majority Leader of the Senate is 78. The people running to replace the president, you know, they're not much younger. Some of them are older than their mid-70s. And, or to put it another way, Donald Trump was born in June of 1946. George W. Bush was born in July of 1946. Bill Clinton was born in August of 1946. A lot of the other people in our politics were born in that range. And that's a strange fact. It has a lot to do with the dominance of the boomers over our self-understanding and over our political culture. And all of that's a long way of saying that one facet of this loss of faith in institutions is the liberalization of our society that began in the middle of the 20th century and that we've lived through, and that almost inevitably brought with it a kind of decline in cohesion. But it has certainly been attached to a growing polarization in our politics that I think has to do with why it has the flavor that you describe. The sense that our institutions are sources of oppression in particular, which is a very powerful facet of how we now understand the problem we have. I think that if you look at what the left and right in our politics traditionally have been, what you find are two parties that are separated largely by how they understand the basic set of questions that confronts our society over and over. On the left, there tends to be an understanding of these as oppressor versus oppressed. On the right, there tends to be an understanding of these as order versus chaos, civilization versus barbarism. There are a lot of issues now in our politics, an unusual number of issues, where the left and right seem to be arguing with each other, but they're actually just giving vent to these very different ways of thinking about what the issues actually are. Think about the immigration debate. The right is just arguing about order and chaos. For Donald Trump, it's all about an invasion, right? And it really is about civilization and barbarism. The left is really arguing about oppressor and oppressed. I think those are both crazy, ridiculous ways of understanding immigration. But our politics breaks down this way. Or think about urban policing. Or think about civic education. A lot of things that now are controversial in our politics are so because they exacerbate that division. They arise in areas where left and right have the most trouble understanding each other. And I think that the way in which we think about our loss of trust in institutions has been formulated particularly for the younger generation in the left's terms, in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And that is the way to understand the social situation. I think it's not a very good way to understand the circumstances of most of our institutions, but it's how our politics is broken down. I think it's very, very hard to get away from that, and that the only way to really make progress against it is to understand that that's part of what's happening, that oppressor and oppressed is a particular political framework for understanding everything, and that it now presents itself as a way of understanding this challenge. And the way out of it, from my point of view, is to think about this challenge in its own terms, to think about the loss of trust in institutions in institutional terms, and from the kind of framework and vocabulary that I started to lay out here. But I don't think there's an easy way out of the problem you're describing. I think we have to see that it is a problem, that that's not the most natural way to think about our society's situation, and so that at least to start to really argue with each other, we have to start by seeing that we need a vocabulary that is actually that's actually appropriate for the problems we face. Does that help? That's an awfully circular way of getting at your question. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you again for coming here. I'm Andrew. I'm a sophomore here at Yale. So I'm wondering if this lack of confidence in the American people and its institutions strictly a phenomenon constrained to just America, or if this is also shared currently around the world, and if there's really a country or a model in the international community that the U.S. can really follow to restore its faith and confidence in institutions.
It's a great question. It certainly is widely shared. Maybe not quite around the world, but around the West. It is certainly evident in Europe and across the same range of time, from the middle of the 20th century through today. There's a decline in confidence, and in some ways, in some very striking ways to us as Americans, confidence in institutions in Europe is lower than it is here, especially confidence in government. In Germany and in France, confidence in government is lower than it is in the United States, and it has been for a while. And so that's to say that we have to understand these problems at some level in comparative terms. We have to try to learn from each other. We have to see that what's going on here is at least not simply a distinctly American phenomenon. But, you know, there's a pattern in our history where the United States experiences a form of Europe's problems, but not quite Europe's problems. One way to think about it is that we have their problems to a lesser degree. That's generally been right. The age of revolutions was much harder on them than on us. Industrialization, which was very hard on us, was much harder on Europe. The age of political radicalism at the beginning of the 20th century was much more radical in Europe than it was here. We're seeing now a kind of demographic decline that's much sharper in Europe than it is here. The patterns are similar, but not of the same magnitude. And I do think that there are ways that our society has certain resources at its disposal to help it address these problems. But there are also ways that American society is going to suffer these problems in a more severe way. One is the simple fact of the diversity of our society, which I think is a great thing about our society, but it means that cohesion is harder, so that if what we lack now is in some form cohesion or solidarity, we have a different challenge on that front than Scandinavia does or Japan. And it's challenging in a different way, and we just have to deal with that because those challenges come with countervailing advantages that are pretty great. So I think it certainly makes sense to try to learn from some comparative examples. The trouble is there aren't a lot of examples of how to do this well. Certainly not in genuinely pluralistic democracies. And so I think we're facing this together. We should certainly look for ways to learn from Europe where we can, but I'm not sure that there's any simple set of lessons to work with at this point.
No, then let's give one more. No,
yeah,
of course.
Thank you. Hi.
That's fine. That's just...
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Olivia Martinez. I'm a new master's student here in the School of Music, and I'm trying to dip my feet in and start learning more so I can be a better, more educated voter. And since a lot of this is not talked about, especially in the arts field, so I was wondering if you have any advice for reading or like one certain resource that you would highly recommend, or just a field to investigate on my own.
Well, thanks for the question, and it's just wonderful to hear. I would have to say this is a particularly hard time to just become an informed voter. Because everyone is yelling at each other about peculiar things, and we have these very kind of high context arguments going on in our politics where people are arguing about seemingly bizarre things that you really have to dig under to understand what really are the disagreements here, what are people's different priorities, what are their ways of thinking. There's a lot of ugliness to it, and our political culture is just not at its best right now. I think it'll get better, and it's been worse, but none of that helps. It's a tough time to get informed. So, you know, that said, I think you ought to look for voices that you think you can trust, and you should look for them in different parts of our politics, on the left and on the right, and different parts of the left and the right. It's not easy to say. I mean, if you want to talk later, I can suggest to you a kind of list of people I try to read and follow, including a lot of people that I don't agree with, that I think are serious, responsible people. I would say that those people tend to talk about Donald Trump less than other people in our politics, and tend instead to talk more about the trends that are driving our social life, the challenges that we face. But more than anything, they talk about the future. The striking thing to me about our politics right now is that we're not talking about the future very much. There aren't a lot of arguments about where we want to be in 2030. I think that actually has to do with what I got at before, which is that our politics is really dominated by people in their mid-70s who just think about 2030 in a different way than somebody who is 35 or 25. Sorry. It's not they don't care about it, but they certainly think about it in a different way. And so, you know, 2030 is not that far away, right? So it's as close to us now as what, 2007? but we don't think about it at all. We don't talk about it at all. We're not making plans. We're not building much. The arguments we're having are really bizarrely sort of presentist arguments. And one good flag, one good signal about people who you may want to listen to is that they seem to be talking about what we should be building now and what we should be planning for and how we can be in a better place in 2030. And so there are such people. There are such people on both the left and the right, but they are rare. Yeah, as I say, we can chat and I can see what your interests are exactly, but the challenge you pose is not just a matter of not being immersed in politics. It's a challenge for everybody. I certainly find it's a challenge for me.
Any more? One on the end here, sure.
Thank you again for your comments today. The one question I'd like to pose to you entered my mind when you were talking about the different perspectives of the left and right looking at similar problem, and that the left may view the world through an oppressed and oppressed people's perspective, yet the liberal left seems to be going towards forms of Eastern government that were socialistic or communistic, that were the most oppressive that we've seen in the history of the world. Do you have any thoughts on how they might reconcile that line of thinking if they're concerned about oppression, yet they're leaning towards socialism?
Yeah. You know, I mean, in one sense, the answer to that may be that it's an old story and that a certain kind of progressivism has pointed in that direction for a long time. But I actually think it's also important to say that we shouldn't take the socialism talk too seriously. I've really been struck, and I have to say, I spent some time with a pollster from Pew about 6 months ago at a series of focus groups that they did with 30 people in each case. One of them was with younger people. And several of them talked about socialism when they were first kind of asked to talk about their priorities. And it turned out they just had no idea whatsoever what socialism was. And that's not to say that people on the right have a better idea of what they're for, but it was really striking that it wasn't connected in their mind at all to, you know, surely not to Venezuela and North Korea, but it wasn't even really connected to government ownership of the means of production or to the sort of centralization of economic life. It was almost literally about being social and caring for other people. And I you know, I don't want to draw too much from that. This was about 12 people chosen to be representative, but look, I'm sure there are people on this campus who know what they mean when they say socialism, but I'm sure there are also people who say it and don't know what they mean. And I would say that the inclination to talk about socialism is more the result of a failure of people like me, of people who want to defend markets and want to defend the rule of law and the traditions of our political culture, than it is a success of people who actually want socialism. I think it's a function of a loss of confidence in capitalism and a function of a loss of confidence in general that drives people to want that thing which seems like it is the opposite of what we have. And so that suggests to me that the answer to it isn't really going to be about socialism. So you say to someone, well, that points to Venezuela. Well, I don't want Venezuela, and they really don't. That's not what they want. They don't want an empty supermarket. But seeing the connection between this and that, and also having an actual answer to the concerns you actually have about the legitimacy of our contemporary society and its institutions is the essential thing. And I think that is up to the defenders of those institutions, which means especially that it's up to people on the right to make a more appealing and intellectually serious and honest case than we have done in the last 20 years. And that's just, you know, it's much easier to say, well, they're all turning to socialism and young people are crazy. Young people are not any more stupid than they always have been. I think there has really been a failure to make the case for their inheritance to them that is a failure of our political culture, at least as much as it is a failure on their part, as I see it.
Hi. Again, thank you for being here. My name is Lily Horton. I'm a sophomore in Yale College. I had a question about the alienation that you were talking about earlier. You're saying that our communities tend to be more divided today and that leads to a lot of the polarization that we're seeing. So my question was, how much do you think globalization in the last couple of decades, as well as a rise in new technology, particularly in the digital age, how do you see that as connected to that alienation?
Yeah, I think it's connected. I tend to think it's not the most fundamental driver of that kind of alienation. You know, globalization matters to the degree that it has displaced people, right? That it's removed people from the kinds of connections they had to where they are, that were largely economic connections, stable jobs, a way to have the same kind of way of life that the previous generation and your family had. That's something that a lot of people want, and that's become harder to have in modern America. And globalization is certainly one reason for that. And technology has, in some important ways, exacerbated the ways that we separate ourselves from one another. I would say it's a little bit counterintuitive. It's not what was expected of information technology, but it's made it much easier to be a functional loner in America, to just not need other people in the course of life. And almost every attractive technology is a form of making it easier for us to be on our own, or to have less to do with other people. I'll give you an example. The self-scanner at the supermarket is often sold as a way to speed things up. The self-scanner at the supermarket does not speed things up. It is slower than the clerk, almost always. But it is a way to not have to talk to anybody and to not have to have anybody look at what you're buying and kind of give you a face about it or ask you a question about it. And it's really popular for that reason. It is just a way of not having to interact socially. You know, Uber's better than a taxi basically because you just kind of get out and leave at the end. If we're honest with ourselves, it's convenient, yes, but it's also a way to be less connected with another person. And a lot of what the internet has brought us and a lot of what mobile technology has brought us are these ways of having things kind of facelessly come to us when we need them, rather than having established connections with other people. So yes, I think technology has had something to do with that. Globalization has had something to do with that. But I think there is also underlying it a weakening of core institutions like family, like religion, like civil society. We've seen it in politics too. Our political parties, you know, we have very, very intense partisanship now, in part because we have very weak parties. They barely exist, really, as institutions. And I think the fraying of these institutions has had a lot to do with why people just feel less connected to where they are and who they live with. They've all tended to atomize us. And so I would look at globalization and information technology as facets of that. But I think what's happened in family and religion and civil society is probably deeper at the end of the day. That may be, I mean, I would tell you, that is also my kind of prejudice. So take it for what it's worth. That's what I tend to think would be the case. But I would say it seems to be the case that in places where family breakdown has been greatest, this kind of alienation is most extreme. It's more aligned with that than it is with places that have been most affected by globalization, for example. Thank you.